Night settled over Karnak with a heaviness that felt intentional, as though the stones themselves understood what was about to unfold. I remember how the shadows lengthened across the columns, swallowing the last traces of sunlight until the precinct belonged entirely to the priests. A whispered decree drifted beneath the great pylons, carried by men who moved with the certainty of those who believed they spoke for the gods. The gods withdraw their favor tonight. Those words, later found etched onto a scratched ostracon, did not simply describe a ritual. They announced a political execution disguised as divine warning. Torches flickered against carved hieroglyphs, making the ancient stories appear to shift and breathe. The priests walked between them like judges reviewing evidence, their footsteps echoing in a rhythm that suggested a verdict had already been reached. No pharaoh stood beside them. The king waited in his palace, surrounded by guards who could defend his body but not his throne. Rumors claim he paced endlessly, fearing a sign that would turn his people against him without a single blade drawn. Within Karnak's sacred enclosure, star charts older than entire dynasties lay unrolled across polished stone. The priests interpreted each constellation as if the universe itself endorsed their authority. They read omens not as suggestions but as declarations, pointing to rising stars that meant ascent and darkened patches of sky that foretold ruin. A single misinterpreted alignment could unravel a reign. A deliberate misinterpretation could destroy it entirely. One scribe recorded how his hands trembled as he copied the ritual words, knowing that failure to write them precisely would be treated as sabotage. Another wrote of hearing a chant unlike anything known in official liturgy. The chant rose at midnight, echoing through the columns until the air seemed to vibrate. A fragmentary papyrus references that moment only once, noting simply, "This ceremony must never be repeated." No scholar has fully deciphered why. By dawn, the priests emerged with solemn expressions, as if mourning a decision made long before the stars were consulted. When the king received their message, witnesses noted that he staggered. He asked no questions, as though he already understood the consequence of a ritual he had never seen. Within weeks, uprisings emerged at the edges of the kingdom, moving with a speed that suggests coordination rather than coincidence. Yet the deepest mystery is the unnamed ritual mentioned in that papyrus. It was performed only once. It was banished from record, and its outcome reshaped the balance of power between crown and temple forever. What judgment was spoken that night, and whose voice truly pronounced it? The deeper one walks beneath a temple, the more the air presses in, thick with the weight of secrets guarded for generations. I descended those narrow passageways once, long after their rituals had ceased, and still felt the presence of those who endured trials few survived unchanged. Stone corridors stretched ahead, lit only by the faintest reflections of torchlight. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, each drop echoing like a heartbeat, masking the low hum of chants that once reverberated through the walls. These were not chambers of worship. They were crucibles. Inscriptions carved into the stone at Abydos described trials that tested both body and mind. Initiates spent days without sunlight, fasting, waiting for visions formed from exhaustion and fear. Priests claimed these visions revealed truth. Others believed they rewired loyalty, binding men to the temple with a devotion deeper than any oath. Archaeologists uncovered a limestone basin stained by substances impossible to fully identify. Some believe it held purifying oils. Others suspect hallucinogenic mixtures. Whatever its purpose, it shaped the rites described only in forbidden texts now fragmented beyond restoration. Greek observers, centuries later, wrote of men emerging from these chambers unrecognizable, their voices softened, their confidence stripped to something almost obedient. One object haunts me more than all others. Beneath Dendera lies a blocked doorway sealed with uneven stone. The markings carved into its frame do not match any initiation rite known from other temples. They resemble warnings rather than invitations. A worker who cleared debris nearby reported feeling cold air leaking from within, though no opening remained. If that chamber held a ritual unlike any other, then its secrecy mattered more than its practice. And the priests who sealed it ensured no one, not even future generations of their own order, would uncover what occurred inside. What trial demanded such silence, and what initiate walked in, only to never walk out? Dawn crept across the Nile in a thin band of gold, and as the sun touched the temple walls, massive gates swung open with a ceremony that felt less like worship and more like governance. In CE, I watched as scribes, overseers, and laborers streamed inside, each one part of a machinery powerful enough to rival the pharaoh himself. These temples were not sanctuaries. They were empires carved within stone, fortified by bureaucracy and cloaked in divine authority. Every offering recorded in hieratic script strengthened their reach. Every decree spoken beneath a painted ceiling shaped the fate of countless families. At Medinet Habu, the walls show endless lines of workers carrying grain, oil, linens, and livestock. The images are framed as devotion, yet their posture reveals something harsher. These were taxes paid to gods who never walked among them, collected by priests who interpreted silence as approval. Merchants feared the rustle of scrolls more than the clang of soldiers' spears. One misinterpreted omen, one unfavorable reading of a goat's entrails, and a family's livelihood could vanish into temple storerooms. A local farmer once carved a desperate message into a broken pot, later found near a collapsed granary. He wrote of losing his entire harvest because a priest declared his field ritually polluted. There was no appeal, no recourse, only a command spoken in the name of a god he dared not question. Such stories rarely reached official archives because priests controlled what was written and what was erased. Their power stretched far beyond ritual. They resolved land disputes, managed irrigation, and employed thousands. In some districts, the priesthood owned more territory than the ruling dynasty. Their wealth flowed through meticulously maintained ledgers that documented every grain counted, every animal received, every worker assigned. These ledgers allowed priests to shape the economy with the precision of mathematicians and the authority of kings. Yet in one temple archive, archaeologists uncovered entries where entire transactions had been scraped away. The erasures were deliberate, clean, and unnervingly final. The missing lines appeared during a period marked by unexplained shifts in land ownership and sudden changes in labor distribution. Someone had hidden a truth powerful enough to warrant rewriting the temple's economic memory. As I examined the faint grooves left behind by the erased ink, I felt the weight of decisions made centuries ago by men who believed themselves untouchable. What transaction disappeared under those careful strokes? Whose land was taken, whose life overturned, and which priest calculated that no one must ever know? Whatever truth those lines held, it allowed the temples to tighten their grip on the kingdom with the quiet certainty of rising floodwaters, slow, inevitable, and devastating. Night in ancient Egypt did not belong to silence. It belonged to calculation. High above the desert, stars pulsed like warnings carved into the dark, and within temple observatories, priests interpreted each movement with the authority of generals. Their charts of the decans, their measurements of lunar cycles, and their observations of Sirius rising before dawn were treated as strategic directives. When I studied the military annals from the reign of Senusret III, I saw not the confidence of a warrior king, but a ruler halted repeatedly by priestly decrees that claimed the heavens predicted calamity. These delays altered the fate of armies long before a single soldier lifted a spear. Generals paced beneath sandstone lintels as astronomer priests debated celestial shifts recorded on palm leaf scrolls. Their verdicts decided whether troops marched, waited, or retreated. The priesthood believed the cosmos spoke in patterns, and any leader who ignored them invited ruin not only upon himself but upon Egypt's divine order. One commander carved a confession into a clay tablet, later buried near his camp. I was ready. The men were ready. Yet the stars were said to be wounded. His frustration revealed a truth often hidden behind temple walls. Military strength meant little when priests claimed the universe objected. In a sealed chamber at Edfu, archaeologists uncovered a star map etched into the ceiling with uncanny precision. But beneath the carved constellations were scratched corrections, small adjustments that suggested disagreements among the astronomer priests themselves. Those faint marks, nearly lost to sand and time, told a story of internal conflict shaping decisions of life and death. If the priesthood disagreed, whose interpretation guided the king's orders? And how many soldiers died because one reading prevailed over another? The tension between military command and celestial decree appears again in a fragment from a Theban papyrus. It describes a campaign postponed indefinitely after a rare alignment was deemed ill-omened. The priest who delivered the pronouncement later received a land grant, raising suspicions about whose interests truly guided the reading. Control over the stars was control over the kingdom. Yet the most unsettling discovery lies in an astronomical column found in a ruined temple court. Among familiar symbols of Orion, Sirius, and the northern circumpolar stars, researchers identified a pattern that fits no known Deccan list. The unfamiliar arrangement is framed by erased glyphs, as if someone removed the explanation long ago. I traced the grooves carved by an ancient hand, and felt the weight of a secret that even dynasties feared to record. What omen once appeared in that pattern? Did it halt an army poised for conquest, or force a king to retreat from an unseen threat? The priests guarded these interpretations with a fanatic devotion. To them, the heavens were not distant fires. They were divine commands. Every scratched correction, every erased inscription, and every delayed military order proves that priestly power extended far beyond temple precincts. It reached into the hearts of soldiers, the strategies of kings, and the destiny of Egypt itself. Kings approached oracles not as rulers but as supplicants. In the dim sanctuaries of Siwa and Thebes, I can almost hear the creak of wooden poles as priests lifted sacred statues onto their shoulders. To the crowds, the movements of these divine effigies were the voice of gods. To the priests, they were instruments of influence. Each tilt, each sway, each deliberate pause shaped prophecies that guided treaties, executions, and royal marriages. The line between divine revelation and human manipulation blurred beneath incense smoke. Reliefs show these oracle processions winding through temple courtyards. Priests carried barks adorned with gold, their eyes fixed forward, their faces carved into expressions of solemn duty. But inside palace correspondence, a different truth emerges. Pharaohs begged for favorable omens before confronting rivals or quelling uprisings. One letter from a new kingdom ruler pleads, "Let the gods speak mercy." Fear, not confidence, drove many to kneel before voices they could not question. In a recently uncovered priestly diary, a troubling passage appears. The efficient rites of an oracle night when the statue's movements faltered, and the voice interpreted through ritual gestures became hollow, like wind in a tomb. Even the priests, guardians of certainty, felt dread. Whatever message emerged that night, it rattled them deeply enough that the next morning the king ordered the entire transcript destroyed. Stone chips found beside a refuse pit at Karnak show traces of broken inscription, perhaps fragments of the very record the king wished erased. They bear marks consistent with deliberate defacement, as if someone feared the message might outlive its moment. Even in fragments, the atmosphere around the oracle becomes clear. Power rested not in the throne, but in the words whispered through moving statues. Yet one question lingers like the echo of a chant. What prophecy emerged that night which even a pharaoh could not bear to see recorded? Locked behind cedar doors and guarded alcoves, the temple libraries of ancient Egypt held more than sacred hymns and ceremonial instructions. They contained the manuscripts that shaped the kingdom's destiny, the books of the hidden chamber. These scrolls were protected with such ferocity that even high-ranking officials never saw them. Only a handful of priests, men raised from childhood to guard mysteries older than the dynasties themselves, were permitted to touch the brittle papyri. Within these pages, I find evidence of a knowledge system that fused science, superstition, and politics into an engine of power that could influence the lives of millions without ever being named aloud. The libraries were sanctuaries of silence. Torches burned low to protect the ink, and every footstep echoed between limestone shelves as if reminding the priests that each secret carried consequences. Walls at the Temple of Karnak depict scribes bending over scrolls with deliberate care, their reed pens tracing symbols that advised kings and restrained them in equal measure. These texts preserved astronomical observations, medicinal remedies, exorcism rites, and prophecies that blended divine authority with political calculation. When I read the Saqqara fragments, I see formulas written to bind rebellion at its root. The phrasing reveals a chilling truth. What appeared as ritual protection was often a framework for controlling populations. Archaeologists working near the causeway at Saqqara uncovered a collapsed chamber containing shelves fused by time and heat. Within the rubble, they discovered pieces of a codex whose contents referenced rituals used to restrain dissenters. It named no individuals, yet its instructions described punishments disguised as purifications. The implications were unmistakable. Priests did not merely consult the gods. They shaped the state's methods of coercion through ritual language that concealed intent beneath the guise of sanctity. These texts became the foundation of an invisible political system that paralleled the royal court. A junior priest left behind an ostrakon that offers a rare emotional window into this world. On the shard's rough surface, he confessed that he had glimpsed a forbidden diagram titled The Unmaking of the Crown. The drawing, now lost except for the title, must have terrified him, for his lines tremble across the clay. His fear was not of divine punishment alone, but of the political danger. If the priests guarded knowledge of how a king might fall, then they held power that rivaled even the pharaohs. This minor testimony reveals what official inscriptions hide. The temple hierarchy controlled not only spiritual destiny, but also the fragile balance of royal legitimacy. Each library organized its scrolls according to increasing layers of secrecy. Outer shelves held hymns and seasonal guidelines. Deeper rooms preserved medical papyri like those of Ebers and Kahun, whose treatments often blurred into magic. But the innermost recesses contained the truly restricted writings, ritual diagrams inked in red, star charts that predicted famine or stability, and prophecies written in coded metaphors. The priests who read them became indispensable to kings while remaining untouchable by them. The pharaoh ruled by divine right, but the priests interpreted the divine itself. Still, the most striking discovery comes from a sealed jar found beneath a collapsed archive chamber at Abydos. Wrapped in linen and protected with resin, the scroll inside bore a royal seal, not a priestly one. Someone in the royal household, perhaps even a king, sought access to knowledge forbidden to rulers. The seal shows signs of being pressed hastily, the edges uneven, suggesting urgency rather than ceremony. When I consider this piece of evidence, I see a vivid scene unfold. A pharaoh, uncertain of his reign, reaching beyond the sanctioned teachings to seek truths concealed from the throne. Why would a king risk such sacrilege unless he believed his survival depended on it? The scroll itself, though damaged, preserves enough lines to reveal its purpose. It described a ritual of hidden ascent, linking the stability of the throne to astronomical cycles. One passage warns that, when the star of the eastern horizon falters, the crown must answer in secrecy. This ambiguous phrase hints at a direct relationship between celestial events and political change. If a king believed the heavens signaled a threat, he might have acted without priestly mediation. Perhaps that was the danger. Kings who read forbidden texts stepped into a domain the priesthood worked tirelessly to limit. The jar's placement raises further questions. It had been deliberately buried within the foundation stones of the archive, as though someone feared discovery. If a pharaoh stole knowledge meant only for priests, then the temple hierarchy would have faced a profound crisis. Control depended on exclusivity. Once a ruler crossed the boundary into forbidden wisdom, he became unpredictable, capable of wielding sacred power without priestly guidance. Was the burial of the scroll an attempt to hide the king's transgression, or a desperate act to keep him from learning more? Throughout Egypt's long history, tensions between the throne and the priesthood surfaced repeatedly. The reign of Akhenaten, with his attack on the established cults, offers the most dramatic example, but even in quieter centuries, the libraries held potential sparks of conflict. When the priests controlled the hidden texts, they controlled narratives of origin, legitimacy, and destiny. Every prophecy could be shaped. Every ritual could be timed for advantage. Every cure or curse could strengthen allies and weaken enemies. These writings formed the invisible architecture upon which power rested. In the end, the hidden texts reveal a world where knowledge was weapon, shield, and currency. The priests preserved their dominance not through armies but through secrets. And somewhere, beneath the fallen stones of an archive, a single scroll sealed with a king's emblem whispers of a moment when that boundary briefly broke. What truth did that forbidden text offer him, and how did its revelation alter the fate of Egypt itself? Night descended over Thebes like a slow-closing hand, and the priests welcomed it as their truest ally. In the deepening blue above the temple roofs, they saw not darkness, but a veil through which power could be drawn. The coffin texts and pyramid texts reveal that spells meant to guide the dead were also shaped to influence the living, binding decisions of nobles and commoners alike to the authority of the temple. These sacred words, etched into tomb walls and traced onto papyri, promised protection, vengeance, or persuasion depending on who recited them and for what purpose. When I walk among the ruins of Deir el-Bahari, I picture the blackened altars archaeologists uncovered, their soot layering centuries of hidden offerings, each ember part of a ritual performed far from the eyes of the court. The night temple was a place where boundaries thinned. Priests approached it barefoot, carrying bowls of natron, oils infused with desert herbs, and miniature figurines representing ancestors whose voices they claimed to summon. These rites echoed through the surrounding cliffs, muffled within chambers carved for secrecy. A noblewoman's preserved letter speaks of political danger lurking within these ceremonies. She warned her son to respect the night temple, suggesting that refusal could invoke consequences beyond earthly authority. Her words reflect a society where the rituals of the dead shape the choices of the living, intertwining fear with obedience. The mummies themselves reveal further mysteries. In a cache discovered near Deir el-Bahari, archaeologists found a body adorned with amulets placed in an arrangement no known burial followed. The position of each charm, one near the throat, another at the forearm, a third pressed into the palm, resembled a ritual design described only once in fragmentary funerary records. When I examine this evidence, I recognize a deliberate deviation from tradition. This burial was not meant for protection in the afterlife alone. It was crafted for influence, perhaps to anchor a priest's authority through spiritual leverage attached to a powerful family or rival faction. The night rituals forged a chain between ancestors and descendants, binding families to priestly judgment. Through these rites, the priesthood determined which spirits were appeased, which were invoked, and which were weaponized. Such control reshaped alliances in subtle ways. A family blessed in the night temple gained social protection, while one condemned there could lose fields, titles, or heirs. The priests became arbiters not only of eternity but of political survival. Yet the amulet arrangement discovered in that single cache raises a question that shadows every surviving text. Someone designed a ritual outside the boundaries of recorded liturgy. Someone believed that this configuration would grant them power greater than anything written in the official canon. What force were they attempting to manipulate? And why did the priesthood ensure no written explanation survived? What purpose did this unique ritual serve, and how did it empower the priests who designed it? When pharaohs finally attempted to reclaim authority from the temples, they discovered that reclaiming a throne was far easier than reclaiming knowledge. The priesthood responded with silence, their most dangerous form of resistance. Rituals that once crowned kings and sanctified campaigns were withdrawn, leaving rulers spiritually exposed. In the reign of Akhenaten, this conflict erupted into open fracture. Temples were abandoned, not from weakness, but from deliberate refusal. The priests of Amun let their precincts fall quiet, stripping the pharaoh of legitimacy by denying him access to centuries of ritual guidance. Later dynasties struggled to rebuild what had been lost. The libraries were emptied of their most potent texts, and the scribes who once recited sacred words turned their backs on the palace. In Tanis, archaeologists uncovered storage pits filled with shattered ritual tools, scepters snapped in half, bowls broken into shards, and incense burners crushed under stone. These were not ruins created by time. They were acts of defiance. The priesthood destroyed what they refused to share, ensuring that no king could ever reclaim their authority in full. Surviving inscriptions show scenes of royal processions where priests stand apart, no longer offering blessings but observing with cold detachment. In earlier centuries, such a gesture would have been unthinkable. Yet now the balance had shifted. Without the rituals that legitimized his rule, a pharaoh's public authority grew hollow. Temple walls murmured with power withheld, a silence that echoed louder than any proclamation carved on a monument. The emotional weight of this collapse appears in fragments left behind by those caught in the conflict. One scribe recorded that the gods have gone quiet, a phrase that spoke less to belief and more to fear. Without priestly mediation, the connection between crown and cosmos fractured. The rituals that once guided armies, stabilized harvests, and calmed the desert winds slipped into obscurity. But the most troubling discovery comes from a newly found tablet near the delta. Its final line reads, "The power is not gone, only sleeping." These words suggest that the priests concealed their knowledge not out of vengeance alone, but to protect secrets they believed the world was no longer worthy to hold. Whether these truths remain entombed in sealed chambers or scattered across forgotten archives, the legacy of the priesthood lingers like a shadow across Egypt's history. What hidden legacy did the priesthood leave behind, and who might uncover it next?